Hey guys, welcome back to Clownfish TV. This is Kneon. We're going to talk about DC Comics and Gerry Conway calling for DC to cancel all of its superhero comic books. Never thought I would hear those words from somebody like Gerry Conway, but that is the state of the comic book industry, isn't it? I saw this on Twitter. I saw a couple YouTubers covered this. I'm gonna read this article from Bleeding Cool, kind of give my 2 cents on it, and of course, you know, those of you who have been following the channel know that we've been out about half of this week. We were down in Florida checking out what it's like to go to Disney World during a pandemic. So look for a recap, I think, of that trip. Save your money, folks. That's all I'm gonna say. Save your money. All right, so before we get into it, please subscribe for more pop culture news, views, and rants. As always, thank you for the support. And here we go. This is coming from Bleeding Cool. Punisher creator Gerry Conway, legendary comic book creator Gerry Conway, calling for DC to cancel every existing superhero comic and replace them with graphic novels. I am not kidding. I think what's shocking about this is that Gerry Conway is finally admitting that the comic book direct market is in a bad place. A lot of comic book creators, I'm seeing them freak out now. They've had years to I guess regroup and try to address some of the problems in the comic book industry. Some of it being, you know, professional behavior, some of it being price gouging and multiple covers and you know, reaching people outside of comic shops. And there are a whole host of issues related to the direct market. And now that the pandemic has come and basically completely disrupted that business model, it's never going to go back to what it was before. Now we've got Gerry Conway saying, hey folks, comics are in trouble. Yes, Gerry, we know. And we're seeing a lot of people who, you know, look down their noses at crowdfunding, all of a sudden jumping into crowdfunding now and trying to build a life raft after the Titanic has already started sinking. You know, the time to build a life raft is before the ship hits the iceberg, but that's not the comic book industry. They don't think that far ahead. They never have, which is why they're in the place they're in right now. And for all the shade being thrown at comic book fans, calling them dinosaurs facing extinction, I would say the same thing could be said about the comic book creators, that they were looking at an extinction level event. It was staring them in the face for probably 10 plus years, that the direct market was not really the place to be, that they shouldn't put all their eggs in the one basket. And now the meteor has hit, and everybody's kind of choking on the fumes here. So some people are going to escape and evolve into something else, evolve their careers into something else. A lot of people are just going to get caught up in the smoke, and that's going to be it. That's going to be the end of comic book careers for many people. And no, I'm not happy about it at all. I love comic books. I grew up reading comic books. I worked in mainstream comics for several years, and I'm not happy about it. I'm really not. But, you know, I can't say that these people didn't have any warning. I mean, it's been there. It's been there. Instead, they spent all their time attacking YouTubers who were saying, look, guys, the end is near. The end is near. And even other bloggers, you want to talk about Bleeding Cool. I remember Jude Terror writing a post on the Outhousers a couple of years ago saying that the direct market is going to die very, very soon, and the entire comic book industry dogpiled on him for it. You know, so it's they don't like to hear it. They don't like to hear it until it's too late and it's obvious that this is it. Now, DC Comics, of course, has gone through a cleansing, I guess, to get ready for whatever's next. That they had a bunch of people get laid off, that AT&T and Warner Media laid a bunch of DC Comics staffers off, and it seems like they're focusing more on graphic novels. I mean, this is the future of DC Comics, and it's not just like, hey, graphic novels that take place in the main DC Comics universe, but we're talking like turning Zatanna into a YA graphic novel. Of course, we've got this infamous Wonder Women of history, celebrating real-life heroes, and most of them being contemporary politicians and celebrities, including AOC. Badly drawn, by the way. This is not a DC level book, but this is where they're going with DC Comics. And of course, things like this is a Mera manga style Lois Lane in the Friendship Challenge, middle grade graphic novel. But Punisher creator Gerry Conway thinks this is the future of DC. So this is coming from Rich Johnston about 2 days ago. Again, we've been on the road, so I haven't had a chance to comment yet. Gerry Conway, co-creator of the Punisher, Firestorm, Power Girl, Vixen, and yes, Carol Danvers, has something to tell us all on Twitter about what he would do if he were in charge of the comic book industry. But first, a little history lesson. This is what he said. He said, to state the obvious, comic book publishing is in serious trouble. No shit. No shit. And YouTubers have been telling you for years, and you guys just don't want to listen. With a business model that is almost literally has no future. Yet comic books are a source of intellectual property for exploitation in all sorts of popular media and have never had greater potential. So why is this? Why do comics as a storytelling form, superhero and otherwise, have such an enormous impact on pop culture, but comic book publishers are struggling to survive? Why are publishers almost universally failing to succeed at actual publishing? Because they're bad at business. My basic answer is they're pursuing the wrong market. And they've been doing so with increasing desperation since the 70s. No, I think that they've actually been pushing out old school fans that would pay them. And in fact, I think Zach put up a video talking about how the 40-something comic book fans actually would support, and they do support the industry when they give them something they like. Look at Three Jokers. Three Jokers did really well. Look at the Bat books. They've done really well. 30-something, 40-somethings have disposable income. That's something that a lot of young people don't have. There are a lot of reasons for why the comic books have been failing, and I think that there is room for pushing out into other markets, but you can't alienate your core audience either. And that's sort of the problem I've seen with comics. Is it's been a zero-sum game. It's been, we need a new audience. Okay, I agree with that. So let's burn all the bridges with our existing audience, chasing this new audience. And so then if we, on a whim, so it's definitely putting the cart before the horse. So before they build up this new audience, they've already decided they don't want the old audience. Then when they fail to get the new audience, and they've already spurned the old audience, they're like, oh, God, comics are failing. We don't understand why. Why are comics failing? Let's just make comics for nobody, I guess, and hope that we get a Hollywood deal or something. I don't know. So let's put aside the incredible business stupidity of depending on a single distribution method. Again, YouTubers, even Jude Terror have been pointing this out, and they were blasted for it, putting all their eggs in the one basket. The problem is bigger. The defined audience for mainstream comics is an audience that by definition constantly shrinks. Well, it does when you charge too damn much for comics. You make comics very hard to find, and again, you actively push away your existing consumer base. Sure, it's going to shrink. For a variety of self-enforcing reasons, publishers have defined the primary audience for mainstream comics as long-term fans and potential collectors. Hence, fan-oriented navel-gazing continuity, tri-annual events, reboots, collector, you've already contradicted yourself. Tri-annual events. A long-time comic book fans don't want the events, most of them. Reboots. What's the purpose of a reboot? If you've got an existing fan base, that they're going to go back and be like, oh yeah, this happened in the 1980s. I remember that. Why do you have to reboot it? No, because you're chasing that audience that you want, but you're not taking care of the audience you already have. Collector-oriented variant covers, that's a business thing. That's not for the fans. That's for companies like Marvel to double, triple, 27 times dip on people. Every single one of these marketing ploys is designed solely to appeal to existing readers. Nah. Even reboots, ostensibly intended to offer jumping on points to new readers, actually require familiarity with the previous iterations to provide interest. New readers aren't welcomed by the existing creative strategy at the two mainstream publishers. If anything, new readers are actively discouraged by the publisher's frantic pursuit of motivated existing readership. Clubhouse is closed. Stay out. You know, I jumped into comics in the early 1980s as a little kid. And Marvel at that point already had 20 plus years of history. DC Comics had much more than that. And I got the basics. You know, they always had new storylines or whatever that were good jumping on points. But I got the basics. They always kind of recapped, like, here's the X-Men, here's what they do, here's a little, here's who's who or whatever. But and yeah, sometimes I felt a little lost, but the stories were so good and so engaging that, I would go back and fill in the blanks. I would ask my friends, or I would ask, people working at the comic shop, like, well, what's the deal with this character? What's the deal? Because they act like they know each other. And you look at the Marvel comics and they were always like, see issue, whatever. So a lot of times I'd go back and buy back issues. I'd be like, oh, okay, this happened in like issue 173 and we're at like 300 and something. So I guess I'll go back and try to find that issue to see what happened. Now, this is, of course, before Google. So, you can just Google like, who was Peter Parker's first girlfriend? I didn't even know who Gwen Stacy was until years later, because I jumped into it when Peter Parker and MJ were getting serious, and I remember the big Spider-Man wedding. I didn't even know who Gwen Stacy was until later, Okay, so publishers, of course, disagree with the analysis. They're always trying to provide on-ramps to new readers. Now we've got a whole history. In the mid-'60s, DC Comics offered a weekly tour of their offices during the summer. Blah, 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 blah. So this is how he got into comics. He said, when I and my cohorts replaced the creatives who'd given the comic book business massive success in the 60s, folks like Stan Lee and Julie Schwartz, we brought with us our boomer self-obsession. Now there's a kernel of truth here, because I want to talk about boomers and millennials and kind of how the two are. I would say I would pair up boomers and millennials against actually Gen X and Zoomers. Because there is a little bit of a difference, I think. We didn't want to create comics for kids. We wanted comics for us. That's the origin of comic book superheroes shift from middle grade readership in the 60s to young adult in the 70s and adults in the 80s, 90s, and beyond. The refusal of boomer creatives and editors like myself and others to let it go. We redefined the readership comics were aimed at, coinciding with a shift in distribution that allowed that redefinition to stick. The result is a dead end for comic book publishing as a business. How would I change this? Well, actually, the 80s and 90s were very good financially for comics until the crash came. And that was publishers chasing speculators, I think. That was a big part of it. But everybody knew the X-Men back in the 90s. Everybody knew, Spider-Man. It was huge. I mean, 80s and 90s were huge for comics. And I do agree that creators should not be creating comics for themselves, but we're seeing that now. But probably one of the biggest mistakes I think that Marvel especially has made is that they're creating comic books. The creators are creating comic books for themselves as sort of like therapy, or the kinds of comics they want to see, and then they cover it up with, oh, this is just representation. It's like, well, no, this is a very niche fanfic that you want to create, that now you're going to make this publisher pay for, make the readers pay for your fan fiction. So in that regard, I do agree with him. But this is what he would do to solve everything, and this is not a good idea. I'd cancel every existing superhero comic book and publish a limited line for middle grade readership, simplify characters and storylines, and eliminate every event that requires more than passing familiarity with the basic simplified continuity. 10 to 15 titles. I actually don't disagree with only having 10 or 15 titles a month. Now, when I, again, first got into reading comics, a kid mowing lawns could afford most of the major Marvel books. They did take chances with other like miniseries and stuff like that, but every month I bought Amazing Spider-Man, Web of Spider-Man, Uncanny X-Men, Avengers, West Coast Avengers, the main books I could buy, because most of them were only, when I started reading comics, were like 75 cents, $1 each. So I could buy, 20 books a month, and I had pretty much all the major Marvel line. Now, again, they always have these oddball miniseries and stuff like that I usually stayed away from, but I kept up with the main titles pretty regularly. You can't do that now. $20 is going to get you like 4 comics, 5 comics, For existing readers, I'd offer a separate higher-priced graphic novel line with whatever expanded adult storyline creators and readers want to explore, but this would be separate, not monthly, not the mainstream, so like a Black series. I'd do everything possible to get monthly comics into supermarkets and movie theaters and Walmart and Target and Costco and offer subscription services through Amazon. Pursue every alternate distribution avenue possible. People have tried that and they've been demonized for it. I'm looking at Alterna Comics. Have tried very, very hard to keep the prices down on their books, and they've tried very hard to get books into places that they used to be, like convenience stores. And what happened? Pros attacked them. The present course taken by the major publishers is a dead end. They're pursuing the wrong readership. There's a bigger audience out there. We just have to welcome them. Yeah, they're already doing it. Yeah, but the problem is they're kind of doing it wrong. Now, I think what Gerry Conway is trying to say is simplify, streamline the line, and bring the age on the books down, and kind of start over and just be like, let's just try to cultivate a new readership. But what DC is going to do is give us versions of characters that are very dissimilar from their traditional superhero counterparts. They're going to take it in a totally different direction. We saw it with the YA Batman book too. I don't think that's a good move, but I do agree with streamlining comics, but this is a pretty radical solution. I don't know. Cancel every superhero comic and just start over. It might come to that. It might come to that out of necessity, because it's definitely, everything's dying on the vine right now. But what gets me is this is everything that YouTubers have been saying. This is what Comicsgate has actually been saying about the state of the comic book industry. And there's been 4 or 5 years of constant media attacks, constant attacks from creators on people who said the very same thing. So again, I want to go back to what we talked about in multiple videos when it comes to the comic book industry. If you're part of the group, if you're part of the clique, you're allowed to say certain things you're not allowed to say if you're an outsider. It's kind of like family being able to roast each other, but if anybody attacks them from the outside, then the entire family is going to turn against you. And that's the comic book industry. Gerry Conway is part of the clique, so people are going to listen to what he has to say. If somebody like Ethan Van Sciver comes along and says the exact same thing, well, he's part of the outsiders now. He's a defector. He quit. He left. He left to save his own ass. And more creators are going to have to do that, because the comic book industry, if you're depending on it to pull itself out of a tailspin, it's not going to happen. Kids have moved on. Kids love comics. They've moved on. They moved on to manga. They moved on to digital comics. They're not reading the monthlies. So I don't know what the solution is to get people back into reading monthlies. Sure as hell not charging $5 an issue. That's a good start, I would say. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up. I'm curious what your thoughts are on this. It does seem that the comic book industry is trying to save itself, but I think it's too little, too late. And I think the corporate overlords of both Marvel and DC have already made their decision that this is just not worth their time. And they're going to do what they can do to make it profitable. And if it's not profitable, who the hell knows what's going to happen? If they can't sell enough copies of Wonder Women of history, who knows what's going to happen to DC Comics. So I'm going to wrap it up. Please subscribe. We'll talk later.